This is This Week in Perspective with me, Adam Simbe. Making Tanzania an industrial mid-income country, as is stated by 2025, has been one of the major agendas of the fifth phase administration. And at every level, and for the leading political leaders, the punchy word has been industrialization. However, despite the ongoing efforts of the government, the questions are, where are we now? Are the fundamentals for takeoff and succeed in place? How much groundwork has been done already towards its implementation? These questions and some of the other questions we raise here, we try to at least highlight the importance of industrialization agenda or mission and where we are and what we should be doing. So to discuss this important agenda with me today, on my right, Gilead Terry from Tanzania Private Sector Foundation, a regular participant. Next is Professor Amon Mbele from the Department of Economics, but University of Dar es Salaam, not but Department of Economics, University of Dar es Salaam. Next on my left is Professor Prosper Honest Ngowi from Mzumbe Business School, Dar es Salaam campus, a famous participant as well. Last but not least, also a regular participant, is Dr. Bohela Lunagelo, a former chief executive of the Tanzania Economic and Social Science Research Foundation. But he's now an independent social and economic analyst. So, gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
As usual, I have to say something about gender balance, but viewers will excuse me for this. At least last week, I had an all-female panel. So there was a gender difficulty here because there was no man other than myself, who is a moderator. But today, I have all male panelists. But it keeps on balancing. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
As I said, this is an important subject for discussion, and definitely it's going to be an ongoing topic for discussion as we go along. So for today, let us look at what is the status of the industrialization agenda, preparations and the laying of the groundwork for implementation. Shall I start with you, Professor Bailey? Where are we? I mean, what is the status of this?
Maybe to start with the last part of the question, the kind of preparations and groundwork for industrialization, I think we have a long and rich history on that, beginning with the first phase government on import substitution, basic industry strategy, and then we picked up with the Sustainable Industrial Development Program, 1996. Then came the Tanzania Development Vision 2025, which informed strategies that followed, and the most important being the integrated industrial development strategy. Then we have this second 5-year development plan, which is focusing on industry. And the target is to reach maybe 20% at least in terms of employment by 2025, employment in industry, and also growth of the sector by 10.5% by 2025. But again, maybe it's important to underline here that when we talk of industrialization, we normally use the narrow definition, meaning manufacturing. Although in industrialization we have also mining, quarrying, water, and electricity. So in terms of the groundwork, I think there has been quite enough done on the ground. I think the only issues that we are facing now are challenges related to implementation and financing.
Are we talking about heavy or light industries, as it were, in the process of our industrialization agenda?
I think where we are now, that we are pursuing almost both heavy and light industry.
At the same time?
At the same time, these are the programs which are in the steel, coal, chuchuma, liganga, and so forth, but also light industry and textiles, food and beverages, and so forth. But I think for the second 5-year plan, the emphasis is more on light industries, and then those heavy industries are agenda for the future, because they take larger investments and more time to take off. So that's the sequence that at least is emphasized in the second 5-year plan.
Okay. How about infrastructure?
Yeah, infrastructure supports industrialization and also supports other sectors, and we have to have a comprehensive plan which looks at both hard and soft infrastructure. Hard meaning rails, roads. Soft is electricity, water, and so forth. So they must go together in order to realize an industrial base.
Okay. Professor Ngowi.
Yes.
Professor, your colleague, Professor Mbele, has given the background of where we are coming from. But apart from, in addition to that background, I want you also to touch, in addition to answering the question, during Mwalimu Nyerere, he tried his best to establish industries in this country. But the story is quite clear, what befell of these industries, and to the extent that they were nationalized, privatized actually, not nationalized, and then who bought them ended up being warehouses and all this. Now, have we really gone into details to learn from the past mistakes as part of the status where we are today?
Thank you. I'll answer this, but also add to what Professor Mbele said, that when we are coming to this new move of industrialization under the first government, it's very important again to remember the past, that it's not really the first initiative that we're having. From mid-1960s, 70s, 80s, there have been various national development plans that, of course, brought a number of industries, as he said, import substitution, industrialization, issues of agro-processing, basic industries, etc. So on your question now on whether we have learned from, should I call the past mistakes, I think now that's where I think we have to really do our assignment well. Because if you look at the type of industries that we want now, the success really depends a lot on the lessons that we are learning from the past. First, if you read the President's speech he gave in the Parliament on 20th of November 2015, it appears again somehow in the 5 years development plan. It appears again.
And what he said during the Business Council meeting.
National Business Council, yeah. So you could see there are kind of three major types of industries. First, industries that will create mass jobs, mass employment. And then now this has a lot of implication, because for an industry that will create mass employment, theoretically from economics theory, professors will tell you, it implies a lot of, they have to be mainly, labor-intensive industries as opposed to capital-intensive. Now we have to learn from the first Nyerere's type of industries. Most of them were labor-intensive. Given the time, technology, maybe it was okay. But now, of course, which now should be correctly interpreted. If we want mass jobs from the kind of industry that we want now, they won't come directly from industries, but then they'll come from the value chains that are linking the industries. Because, today, up-to-date industry will be, a state-of-the-art facility. They're likely to be more capital-intensive than labor-intensive. In order to, this is where the world is now. And so it's very good for those who are implementing the good vision that the president has, for having now the jobs that the industries that are going to create mass jobs. Really, the jobs will not come from the industries as such, but they will come from the value chain. They will not come from this textile industry, but they will come from the value chain, from the cotton farms, from the transporters, from those who are going to feed the industries, etc. But also, Now you have to, if you are learning from the past. Now, of course, when it comes to other type of industry, the envisaged industries are the industries that will be serving the domestic industry, but also export the excess. That's what the president wants, and that's what the plans want, and correctly so. Because you have huge market, domestic market, but also regional market. Now, the question that I have always interrogated is looking at consumers, domestic consumers, there is what we call a taste and preference in economics, where, in my view, most people, if you look at textile, if you look at the footwear, if you look at even some food, really, there is inclination towards a consumption of imported rather than domestically produced goods and services. So then, if you have to learn from the past, maybe you have to learn from the import substitution industrialization in Nyerere's time and what happened. Yeah,
can you really address the individual consumers and tastes in this case?
Yeah, the question of individual consumers and tastes, to me, it's most likely the question, like now, Tanzania, fortunately, we have a rising middle class. I don't know where it's coming from, but then this middle class is spoiled. It's picky, it knows where good things are. So for them, really, it's a question of taste and preference, which again tends to be a function of quality. I'm not saying that domestically produced goods are not of high quality, but again, for some, they would see imported goods and services, for that matter, whether footwear and clothing, to be more of high quality. So it's a high challenge to the private sector, to the Tanzanian producers, to make sure that they produce the goods and services of a high quality, that they, as a consumer, I find it better than taking imported ones. And of course, the third one is, and which is very correct, the president wants and Tanzania wants, is to have industries that will use domestic raw materials, which is quite okay, which automatically, to me, will be really agro-processing. And agro-processing, broadly speaking, from crops, from livestock, and fishery. Now, if we learn from what happened from 1960s, 70s, I think we should be able to attain these goals here.
Do you think the political leadership, whatever, needs to address this question of putting emphasis on using or consuming what is locally produced as opposed to what we import? But of course, we'll come to the question when the private sector comes, and as you said, there's a competition between what is imported and what is locally produced in terms of quality. And that can go on unless something happens. What is that should happen?
Well, now the private sector will tell us, because I think this is again a function of producing the needed quantity and quality, which again boils down to the question of business environment, investment environment, broadly speaking. If one has to produce this textile, this footwear, this one which is higher, this one which is superior than one from, call it Spain, South America, South Africa, this textile, this shirt, which is better than the one from Turkey, from India, from Italy, then really business environment is essential. And business environment is a lot of things, from availability of power, from availability of skills and talent in the labor force, from a good tax regime, predictable policies, legal and regulatory framework. So if we fix what is broken in those areas, we may be as competitive as Italy when it comes to footwear.
While you're still on the floor, before I ask Lunagiro to come in, we remember in the textile area, Mbeatex, Mwatex in Mara. I met, when I was in Switzerland, I met an Egyptian who also lived in in Geneva. When he knew I was from Tanzania, he started explaining how beautiful the country is, and he was wondering what happened to such a beautiful textile industry in Musoma, which was producing Mutex. What happened to it? And then, I come from there, well, actually now it's Songwe, to my dislike, but you pass through, in Songwe, you pass through the structures which were being put there from Beatex. They've gone dead. Now, are these the ones, Professor, you are referring to? As well
I think there are quite a number of issues, because you know, maybe 10 years ago, so we did a book with Professor Kuzilo, whom you know, and Professor McCormick from University of Nairobi on, you know, the impact of liberalization on textile and footwear industry in Tanzania, in Africa actually, with the case of Tanzania.
Yes.
Part of the findings were there's imported footwear and textile used or new, partly contributed into really...
And second-hand clothes.
Yeah, exactly, second-hand clothes, which is again a debate now within the East African community. Really partly contributed into kind of killing because, you know, they were unable to compete. And that's why, again, the question of taste and preference comes in, you know. So I think it's two sides. We as consumers, we want the best, whether this best comes from Italy, whether it comes from Geneva
or from
Tanzania.
Who is the textile.
Yeah, for that matter. Yeah. So really creating these basic necessary conditions at home, I think is essential. It's not really the question of rhetoric. I've heard people saying, like when we had the global economic crisis, buy American, buy Kenyan, buy Tanzanian. As a consumer, at the end of the day, I think it's taste and preference. If economic theory informs as well, reform it informs as well.
Well, do you want to crown it all? But let me hear from the private sector first. Let's hear from the young man.
Yeah, let's hear from him.
Yes, Gilead, you heard the two professors. They've really given us something, you know, to chew in terms of this industrialization agenda. The background, where we are, where we were before, and where we are going, and some of the basics. And he referred to the private sector. In terms of manufacturing in order to compete, all right? So what have you got to say on this?
So I think, first I think we have to appreciate that whenever we talk of industrialization, it is something that the government cannot do it itself. I think that has to be a very basic premise from the beginning. Whenever we speak about industries, yes, there might be some industries that might spur because of government investment or government intervention. But most of the investment in industrialization, we expect it to come from the private sector. So in this liberal economy, the role of the government is limited to creating a good, conducive economic environment that allows the private sector to invest. And I'd like to sort of categorize it in three ways. One, you expect the government to work on hard infrastructure, you know, the ports, if they're efficient, you know, our border systems, our roads, if they allow our goods to pass in good time, but as well if the land is available that people can come and invest easily. And I think on the side of Tanzania, these are the areas that you
forgot energy.
Energy as well. I also think that this is one area that in the fifth phase government we are seeing some excellent traction over the last almost 2 years now. And I think it's in a positive trajectory. But on the second side, you have to have the soft infrastructure. Professor alluded here to, you know, for example, issues like water systems and electricity, but you also have to have the human resources. So, for example, it is said that if we are to move to a middle-income country by 2025, we need our high-quality labor force to move from the current 3% to 15%. So this is 5 times increase in the next 8 years. And this is an area that I personally think that it is still work in progress. But on the third element, which is the business environment, which this is what brings the hard and the soft together for it to be productive. Because if you have the two and you don't have the positive business environment, you don't have the industrialization that you want. Is an area that we have not been doing so well over the last 2 years. The perception of the private sector about the attractiveness of our economy is been ish over the last year and a half. And I think we need to do more to assure investors, to assure Tanzanians industries to expand, to, you know, to instill consumer confidence. And I think if we manage to do that over the next 3-4 years, we will see the acceleration that we still aim to reach for. So this is my thinking, that I think we need to improve on our tax systems because they are the ones that are harming the current industries to expand. And if we don't have very efficient and transparent systems, especially within the business environment framework, we might not be able to attract as much investment we want to achieve industrialization, especially from the private sector, compared to what we want now. So maybe just last point, the 5-year development plan
one or two.
The second one that is currently operational, expects to have around 48% of the investment from the private sector. So this business environment
is there money
huge.
in the private sector?
Yes, there is. There is interest in private sector to invest in Tanzania, and this is not only from domestic private sector. This is all over the world. That's why we are hearing the ranks, all over the place that Tanzania is one of the areas to go invest. But now, for example, a foreign company, cannot invest.
Donald Trump, who is not my favorite fan, as it were.
Yeah.
I read somewhere he's saying, the place to go now is Africa. He fell short of saying Tanzania.
Very true, very true. But now we have to make it easy for them.
Yes.
So for example, East African nationals or sort of international cannot still today buy or bring their capital through our capital markets. Regulations for foreign
governing
investment.
the Dar Stock Exchange.
Exactly. So we listed Vodacom, but we had to go through 3 times to get the whole capital from other countries. We don't need to wait until we need it. We need to open up stepwise so that we attract this capital for industrialization.
Of all what we have said, which ones are we actually, let me put it this way, are we in control of some of these issues we've raised as a country or as a government, as whatever the case is?
Yes.
Are we in control?
Definitely. So, for example, one of the things that has tied up so much of domestic capital is, for example, VAT returns for large-scale manufacturers. They cannot expand when you have, maybe to a tune of 500 billion of your capital tied up in the government system hasn't not been refunded to private companies yet. These are things that we can work on. I mean, we can fast-track the audit that currently TRA is doing to refund VAT to large-scale companies, and definitely they would use that money to expand. So these are things that are within our controls. The capital markets regulations, for example, we can allow East African nationals to access Tanzania's capital market. It is well within our commitments within the East African Common Market Protocol, and it is well within our power to make that happen.
Okay, that's very interesting. Now let me come to our economic and social analysts.
Yes, I think for me, it will be a simple rejoinder because I have exhausted almost everything. So to start with what Prof. Mbele was saying, I think he put it in the right perspective, that for us really to succeed in this goal of industrialization, we must strictly learn from the past, lessons from the past, what went wrong, what went well.
Of course, Professor Gowi also touched on that.
So basically, I think I'll just one of the areas which critically went wrong when we have started to correct for the past 5 years now was the issue of energy. You can't have industries succeed if there's no power. So that one, I think we're on track in terms of trying to correct that anomaly, because power supply is critical, even in thriving, even for small-scale industries, and which you said, although there are no women here, but one of the areas which women entrepreneurs all over Africa tend to start easily is in a small-scale type of industries. Now another area where we think we need to do better and we have to learn, I think I've listed 5 points. Quickly, let me go. One was the issue of having industrial parks, the issue of establishing special economic zones. For simple reason that if you don't have enough power, and that I think that was the logic behind, then give specific areas where you can supply and provide all the needed infrastructure, because you can't spread too thinly all over the country. I think the concept of special economic zones or export zones in some of the countries they call it, we have already established authorities for the two. So I think we're
like
okay
in Benjamin Mkapa.
Yes, but what's still lacking in the regions, and I've been in Mwanza, in Mbeya, Iringa, Njombe, they are struggling now also to
Even
catch.
Tanga?
Yes, even Tanga. So, for example, ESRF right now is working with the Kilimanjaro and the Mwanza, Musoma, to make sure that they also have special economic zones. They have industrial, what they call industrial parks, so that you can make sure. Because one of the binding constraints for domestic, even for foreign investors, is that when they come in, they spend a lot of time trying to find land where to start their business. I think that's he knows better than me. Then another area which might go even beyond the regions is more of a national. It's about the institutions and laws which govern establishing new businesses. As I was working with the regional officers in Mwanza, one of the areas 3 weeks ago we had a workshop there. One of the areas which I shared. Which investors, local investors actually were complaining, was that actually the shock they get when you hear that if you want to establish an industry, there's a one-stop center by the name of TIC.
Yes.
Then you go there, it's true, they have a list of 10 things which you must submit for you to be given special status. And now these are locals telling me that, Mzee, when I started, I tried to find my capital. Then I said, "Okay, let me get this certificate for environmental impact assessment." No, you have been given. Bring the
from TIC
impact assessment.
Now
the other things are easier. Like even before, registering a business used to take long. Nowadays, 24 hours with Umbrella, they've done okay.
Is that so?
It's so easy nowadays.
We've gone to a stage where
but then
Rwanda is.
Now there are some lists now. You go bring the environmental impact assessment certificate. That's where I don't want to go into detail because I don't want to scare our investors. But I think there are some issues there. He knows better on the need for more transparency in terms of what should one expect when you are told to bring an environmental impact assessment certificate or the TFDA certificate. There are many things which, if it was more like a closed-door meeting, we could have shared. Because we want to invite people to come, so we shouldn't scare them off. But I think these are in-house things which we need to do more in terms of really facilitating, making it easier, easier for our people to invest. The other one, I think, these are stakeholders who are telling us in Mwanza, that the government, especially in the regions, because the Islam, they have to compete with Dar es Salaam, because most people prefer to come to Dar. So if Mbeya, Iringa, Mwanza, Kilimanjaro, they want now to Kigoma, they want to compete with the Dar, they have to choose between what you would call, are you tax-driven in terms of facilitating the businesses? Are you facilitating so that you can immediately start getting tax income, or do you facilitate so that you can create jobs? The two tends to conflict, actually. Because if you tell a new investor, starting, especially for indigenous investors, you give them a tax bill on year one, when part of that income, maybe half of the capital they have used actually is from commercial banks on the commercial rates. 20-25%. So if you put up front the issue of tax income, then you are killing that industry, that establishment before it even starts.
Would you have wished that they were given a grace period?
Just like they give to bigger, because at the moment TIC gives only to large with the capital investment of from $100,000 US, 500,000. It depends whether you are foreign or domestic, but the secret to successful industrialization, and if you are talking through the broad range of small scale industries, medium and large scale, is that you must start with the local investors, small scale, which can graduate later to medium scale. Now, for them, you tend to gain more as an economy by actually thinking more of the jobs they are going to create rather than actually the tax income you're going to get. Because we don't have investment banks. The only two banks we have, the Agricultural Development Bank is undercapitalized. The Tanzania Investment Bank is undercapitalized. And I had one investor in Mwanza who told me that he had they agreed with one of the two investment banks that he should have upfront 60% of the investment, So he had to borrow from our commercial banks, you can imagine, the high interest.
Not
So
from
he
the-
was waiting for the 40% now. So it's 3 years which has passed now. After he has put up front 60%, paying interest. You get me? The investment bank, because of the competition to get money from this undercapitalized investment bank, it means that it's been delayed. But the commercial bank are already demanding money now, and the tax people, they wanted
the
share of the tax. That's why I say the two tend to conflict. If you really want to establish to make industries thrive, then I think we have to choose at least for the local industries. We can forego first the issue of tax revenue.
You mean
as
local,
our primary
local
goal.
investors, as it
Yes,
were.
our primary goal should be to create employment, and then once they have established, then you start coming back, because we don't have investment banks. That's where the problem is. If we had that, then it's okay, because normally the interest rate from investment banks are not as high as the commercial banks.
But is it easy to establish an investment bank? For example, Professor Mbere, Gilead, Professor Ngowi, Dr. Lunegero, Adam Simbe, and a few other friends. Can we establish an investment bank? That is the
investment banks, I think, need huge capital, because
You borrow. You go back to the commercial bank and borrow.
Not more commercial.
The commercial banks will need. But the other thing, Adam, which they are telling us in Mwanza, was that since we are reading the Planning Commission's document on priority areas for industrialization, that it will be, let's start with which we have more comparative advantage in terms of agro processing, cotton to textile. You have leather to leather goods. It's the easiest one to start according to the current 5-year plan, and the Prof will participated in preparing.
Coffee to drinking more.
Exactly. At least in terms of value addition for coffee and tea, we are more advanced in that area. I think we are less. There's more work on the cotton to textile and the leather. Now, we must also invest now in terms of raising productivity and production of inputs in terms of cotton, not only the amount of cotton, but the quality of cotton. Not only the amount of leather going into the leather industry, but also the quality of that leather. You know our local cows, they are tattooed everywhere. So they have marks.
All stamps.
So yeah, all stamps. So the leather the skin coming off from these animals it's a problem.
What should be
in terms
done?
of quality.
What should be done?
But also the beef. There's a Tanzanian there in Mwanza, in Misungu, has started a beef in the factory recently. It's called Chobo. Yes. He has to travel all the way to Kagera to get some quality cattle for the factory. Because so again we have to invest. That's where the public the government comes in handy. I think you mentioned that while the private sector is there to invest and convert raw materials into finished goods, the government has an obligation to provide public goods, and one of the important public goods is the research and extension. Making sure that we invest in research to make sure that the cotton we have, actually the current cotton we have, I visited Mwanza Textile, the type of cotton we have is called the short staple type of cotton. It can't produce fine clothes like the one.
How about the one in Chunya?
So, still short. So it means we have to invest in long staple type of cotton. Of course, the Brazilian government is working in collaborating with the Tanzanian government, Ministry of Agriculture. In Mwanza, they are working on that.
To improve
But for beef, is the same. We have to train our farmers to take care of the cattle, make sure that once you slaughter the cows, the hides and skin will be of the needed quality. So those are the homework which our government has to do if we really have to. And then, of course, he mentioned already the issue of taxation, complying to the common external tariffs, etc. Because that was one of the areas, again, which we have to sort out. Because if we allow, of course, under EAC, when it comes to textile, they've all agreed a phasing out period of 5 years, that gradually we contain, restrict importation of of imported either new or second-hand garments. That's the right way of doing it. But for Tanzania, if we have not addressed the issue of the type of cotton we have from our farms, again, after 5 years, we shall not be able to produce the right type of material, which Prof is saying. If people taste and prefer fine clothes, we shall not be having that.
Oh dear. Yeah. But while you're on the floor, Dr. Nagelo, you might be aware of this. We have read, I'm sure, and maybe visited. How is it that Botswana has managed to even have a market in the European Union with
the beef and it's about investment. It's in investment, and it's not necessarily that for them, of course, they are using large scale type of ranches, etc. But I think it's feasible even to have small scale, pastoralists, train them, make sure that they separate their cows into 2 batches, the one which you just want to keep for prestige and those which you want to put for business. I think that's a mindset issue. I think there's a mindset issue of our pastoral communities. Our pastoralists, most of our communities which keep cattle is just like a status symbol. It's like having a Mercedes-Benz. The more cows you have, the more prestige you have. It's not about converting them into any tangible.
And of course, there's a problem now with all these pastoralists. They're taking all their thousands of cattle into the game reserves, and they get chased, they get arrested, all sort of things. But what happened we used to have ranches in this country, a number of them. Okay, in Bukoba,
which are being one of the interventions. Of course, I think because of there was that misjudgment on what's needed to run a ranch, because it's true that the ministry, what it did was to divide some of the ranches and give to our local people. So that they can. It was part of the indigenization, as you know, in those early 2000 years during Mr. Simba's time, when we wanted really that there are some industries. When we are privatizing, I think there was a call that there are some industries which you don't necessarily have to give away to foreigners. Now, if you have a big ranch and you know one national can't run, why can't you split into 2 or 3 entities and then give it to them? But we forgot that even to run such a ranch, you needed some capital, working capital, to operate, because you have to have fodder grass, pasture, which is professionally kept. It's not that once you have to have quality beef, it's not just a question of just leaving the cows running. You have to take care of them. So again, we failed in that area, but because of financing.
We love, I'm sure you have had access to this, Congo beef.
Yes.
It's very fantastic.
Nice. Very different as well.
But who is managing
maybe
this?
I should give credit, actually. There's one in Ruko which Mzindakaya managed. It was part of that plan, actually.
Yes.
We are supposed to have several of those ranches like the
Mzindakaya meat, is it available in Dar es Salaam?
It's more for exports. It's high quality, like the one in the So it's possible.
But some should be for local consumption.
So it's possible. It's possible. But for them, you remember he was given a special special financing guaranteed by government. You remember? There was even some uproar in parliament because people did not understand that you have to finance people. If you really want to succeed in commercial farming, it's not a simple game. It's something which you have to really finance. But he did not let us down. I think he's done the nation proud.
Although he has gone through hurdles.
Naturally, business. But
now, Gilead.
Yes.
Is there a really positive collaboration between the private sector and the public sector in this whole question or mission of industrialization, as the professor replied, the background, where we are, and the throwback, and the lessons learned? Is there a cooperation?
Yes, I think we, in 3 ways, as well, in responding to this question. The first part about this 5-year development plan is the planning phase. And I think this has been excellent in terms of collaborating with the private sector, talking to stakeholders, trying to know what they understand, what are their preferences, what are their challenges, and for it to feature in the plan. So I think in the planning phase, we are seeing quite good traction from the Planning Commission, the Ministry and the government as well in terms of involving the private sector. The second aspect is in the implementation, and I think this is where there's a bit of a challenge in terms of the government doing its own thing and the private sector doing its own thing.
No coordination?
There could be little.
Or consultation?
There could be little, and I'll tell you why. The first element is exactly what the previous conversation alluded to. I mean, what is the support? And this is the deliberate support of the government to private companies in very specific sectors to make them quite competitive so that they can compete in global markets. And I think in this particular area, there has been very slow progress. There has been inclination to listen in terms of a few taxes, a few VAT exemptions here and there, but that has to be quite coordinated and has to be very specifically targeted to very specific industries, very specific players, so that they can earn that competitive advantage. If the government does not take a deliberate measure to support its private sector, then we might not go where we want to arrive. So I think that is a very important thing. But the third element, which I think it is still being very downplayed, is public-private partnerships. I think this is there's a lot of talk in that particular space, but very little work. At local level and regional and district level, excellent. I mean, you hear a lot of public-private partnerships in building markets, in building schools, in building very much needed infrastructures at local level, but at national level, at things that could happen at grand scale, there's very little PPP happening. And this is for obvious reason. At some point, we had a very open PPP policy on the government. There was some, I think, an element of abuse. And then at some point, the government decided that, we're going to have PPP, but it will go through the government procurement processes. And from at that point, you kill all the incentive of the private sector to invest. So, for example, now, if I have a company and I want to go do a feasibility study on a hydroelectric project, I can do it and have my own study, but for me to implement it, I have to go through the government procurement processes and having it competitive processes, exactly, which someone else could end up winning. So you lose. Exactly. So you kill that incentive element of public-private partnership. But I think 2 points that Dr. Lunogelo mentioned, which are quite important in terms of public-private partnership. One is the special economic zones. If we want industrialization in Tanzania, it cannot happen everywhere. It has to happen in a very specific area, in a very specific geographical region, facilitated by the government, by all facilities.
And the benefit being...
Exactly. So I think over the last few years, we have not invested enough in special economic zones or in EPZ. At the moment, the SCZ license is being handed on individual basis. I mean, so you would find one factory in Mkuranga having an SCZ, one factory in Bagamoyo and Chalize having an SCZ certificate. The space in Ubungo is not enough, and we have not created or demarcated, for example, in Dar es Salaam, another area for special economic zone. In this budget, I think there are only 2 small zones that have been budgeted for, one in Musoma and I think one in Kigoma. So, but if we want industrialization in this country, there must be enough budget for special economic zone. The last element is exactly the tax regime that the doctor eloquently put it quite clearly, much more than how I could articulate previously, is the presumptive tax regime. At the moment, if you want to start your business, you have to go to the revenue authority, you have to estimate and assume what you're going to earn in a year, then your tax is going to be calculated from that. That means if I don't sell for that particular year, I'll end up paying tax for something that I did not produce. Moving on an actual, this is what most progressive economies do, they want you to estimate on what you make in a year and declare and pay that tax. What the revenue authority does is does its audit If they realize that in their audit you cheated, then you face consequences that could close your business. But that is deliberate, different from now, where you could close your business from the presumptive, or the business environment could not allow you to operate or to produce and sell at profit. Then you close your own business because of the estimations that were given to you. So it's a holistic approach that I think the private sector could work with the government to achieve what we want, but it needs to be a win-win situation.
Professor Mbele, as we are left with a few more minutes to go, in your view, I'm sure Professor Ngoe can also answer very quickly. So, what exactly are the key issues for the industrialization journey in this country? Could be 3, could be 4, could be 5.
There are about 4 issues which I would say as being critical preconditions for successful industrialization.
Yes.
The first one, as my colleagues have put, is the issue of competitiveness. And competitiveness arises from cost reduction. Now, if that cost reduction is not achieved, our firms or factories will not compete either domestically or even internationally. So competitiveness or cost reduction is the first and foremost element. Second is, as they said, government proactive support. And it should be in, again, about 4 areas.
Government
proactive
support to public sector.
To industrialization program. One is, of course, support to private sector, and the realities are on the ground. Out of about 87% of the industrial establishments in Tanzania are private sector owned. Financing of the second 5-year development plan, 87% is to come from the private sector. So there is no way you can pursue industrialization without active support to the private sector in many, many ways. And also with regard to policy, to have a policy that is consistent. Like now we have a trade policy which is going against industrial policy, land and investment policies which are inhibiting certain actions, and so forth. Third is research and development. I think my colleagues also pointed out, without research and development, there is no industrialization. And lastly, again, as pointed out, is continuous investment in human resources. This is what actually, you mentioned about this vocational education training institutions. They are being trained on all the technology, and when they move to the factories, I had the experience of textile factories, they are talking a different technological language. So even the training has to go hand in hand with the development in science and technology. So these are the 4 elements which I think are important.
What is going to be the role of our newly acquired potential wealth, oil and gas, in the industrialization journey?
Well, if you look at it as a source of power, but of course it has to materialize first, because Professor Mbele knows a lot. That we may not see the first drop of oil tomorrow. It will take time, but then if it comes, now it comes again the question of business environment in terms of power. Of course, it will substantially, in my view, provide a stable, efficient, reliable power. Because if you talk to captains and titans of the industry, they'll tell you what is needed really is a stable, cheap electricity. And sometimes really they'll say, let it be expensive, no problem, but it should be reliable and stable. So if it comes, that will be very good. And of course, if you get it now as a source of revenue, it can help now in fixing these other things. Now, one thing that Professor Mbele has also said, when it comes to human resources, issues of skills and talent, I think there is a lot of, you talk to industrialists, they'll tell you really what is missing maybe, apart from the hard skills, is the soft skills, the mindset, the hard-working culture of young men and women, those kind of stuff, and the technical education. I talked to a number of industrialists. One guy who wants to Tanzania Brush, Sabir Zaveri, will tell you when his children finished the school, instead of sending them to university, he sent them to a factory in Germany to learn by practice. Because people say,
brushes,
because people say really, It's not everybody who can be industrialist. You have to be trained to become industrialist. You may have all the master, all the PhDs, yet you can't work in an industry. It's a culture on its own.
Yeah. Let me come in as time is running out. Right there, you referred to energy as a major issue. We also talked about it and the rest. We are one of the countries now in this part of the world where uranium is found. Why is it that we cannot use uranium to have nuclear energy for purposes of development? Of course, the big powers will look with very serious eyes to any country that is producing uranium and or export, whatever. But can't we argue as Tanzania that for us to industrialize in the next 40, 56 years, we need energy, and the only reliable energy is nuclear energy?
There are a lot of issues around there. I've been in Namtumbo specifically, and Liganga, not Liganga, but Namtumbo, and deep in the village. That there are a lot of issues around uranium, on whether really Tanzania is ready from environmental point of view, from health point of view, you know. But of course, now I think also the investors have pulled out for some other reasons. Really, the key issue is, whereas it may look nice, but arguments really will be, maybe it's too, you know, in terms of technology, in terms of preparedness, you know, it's very rather dangerous, you know, transporting
security,
it, you know, health, environmental impact, you know, all those kind of stuff.
So we should continue to rely on hydro.
Well, we have a lot of power mix. We have hydro,
Gas.
we have oil and gas, we have the Mchuchuma thing, you know, the coal and this.
All right, all right. Now, time, my God, I told this guy. Okay, we've almost covered everything for this journey. I almost, because you and I have our favorite discussion point is EPA, the Economic Partnership Agreement, and the argument of Tanzania government, in fact, Benjamin Mkapa and Magufuli is, you know, this EPA thing, you know, we are going to industrialize. What will happen to our products? But let's leave it as that. So let me start here. Few challenges ahead for this industrialization agenda.
So for me, let me put it this way. I take this like it's an opportunity for government to fine-tune the way it conducts business. I think the voice from the private sector operators I've talked to, that we need a more facilitating government, a more facilitating bureaucracy at the local government level, in the district and headquarters. And I had very interesting stories to tell. Is the way our local business people are being discriminated or looked down upon by the bureaucracy. They are not assisted as they wish to be assisted.
So
but it's about the mindset.
All right.
Our government system, and I was given an example of the way even they report. The trade officers, for example, in their monthly report, they will be reporting how many businesses they have closed.
How many have been
exactly. That's the anecdotal example on why we need, this government should invest actually in changing the mindset that everybody is a pro-private sector.
So that all of us
should be
can sing the
he's
same
there,
song.
Yes, he's there to assist the private sector to solve the obstacles they change. If they can do that, then we shall go a long way.
Very quickly.
I think it's a culture. I think that is one of the elements that might be a big challenge in the future. Only about 98% of Tanzania industries are small scale. About only 19% of Tanzanians have regular savings. So the domestic capital formation to start new industries, small scale industries, most of it is still going to sort of wait for capital.
Because
very
the rest are burying
capital.
their money under the pillow.
And very expensive capital with, 18-20% interest rates. So unless we also change our mindset in terms of having savings and being able to use our savings to start industries, we might not be able to benefit from this.
Professor, very quickly.
Yeah, industrialization is a process. It's not something that can be achieved within a very short period of time. So what's needed is prioritization and sequencing, I think, which the second 5-year plan and the current phase government moving towards the right direction in terms of sequencing and prioritizing those where we have comparative and competitive advantage, like the agro processing, and where demand is increasing domestically and even
I read somewhere where Dr. Mpango, the Minister for Finance, was officially inaugurating or launching this book, the Tanzanian Industrialization Journey, where he said maybe we should also start protecting and nurturing our local industries. And he specifically mentioned Bakresa Group, and Mohammed Enterprises, because they have a competitive edge in terms of marketing within and beyond. All right. What else?
I think all this boils to business environment, really. Yeah, so long as we have business environment correct in terms of skills and talent, energy, access and availability of finance, in terms of infrastructure, but it's also predictable legal and regulatory framework. I think if we fix that, then everything should take place, because the private sector really reacts to this good environment.
Okay, well, my panelists, thank you very much. I'm being warned I'm going to exceed the few minutes remaining, but I thank you very much for for your contribution to the discussion on this very important topic. I'm sure by the end of the day, if everything is in place and we actually take off, the benefits are going to be greater for this country and for our grandchildren. Viewers, you've heard the views of my panelists here. The determination, zeal, and importance that this administration attaches to it, that is the industrialization agenda, is certainly admirable and indeed recommended, and that all Tanzanians should accept and embrace it for its success. Willing to bring of course, it will bring tremendous positive developments for this country. We need to stand firm and learn from the past, as we heard from my panelists here, mistakes where we went wrong. The 5-year development plan launched in 2016, Professor Mbele was very much involved, tried to address the shortfalls within the first 5-year development plan and provide a blueprint as Tanzania embarks on an industrialization path in the next 5 years, 2016 to 2021. There are positive signals of effective PPP, that's a public-private partnership, as we heard from Gilead here, with a few exceptions here and there in the process, as the latest book, Tanzania Industrialization Journey 2016 to 2056, launched by Minister Mpango, or authored by Ali Mufuruk and his colleagues, including Moremi Marwa. The authors, Mfuruki, Moremi Marwa, Kasiga, Mauji, highlight several issues that needed to be addressed for Tanzania to successfully move through 40-year industrialization journey, which started, of course, in 2016. They suggest, for example, very quickly, setting priorities, as Professor Mbele says, dealing with the energy, Professor Ngoye, issues, revamping the education system, the vocational and normal education for the human resource capital, funding new ways of mobilizing capital and economic patriotism. The book is worth reading, my viewers. We should all, as patriotic citizens, join the government's efforts to achieve the goal of our country to industrialize. This is all we have for you today. Until next Sunday at the same time, and on Thursday at 15 hours for the repeat program. And we have my panel, Gilead Terry, Professor Amon Mbele, Professor Prosper Ngoi, Dr. Bohera Runegelo, and the TBC Television Center crew. Thank you, viewers, and goodbye.